Hey everyone, you found another episode of Exploring Kodawari. The topic for this episode was the science and craft of craft beer. It's a topic that fits perfectly with the Kodawari concept of the podcast, in that it's an endless rabbit hole of knowledge and creativity. Seriously, there's way more that goes into brewing than you probably realize. Now, I've had plenty of experience with, drinking beer, but neither Yanka or I have enough beer knowledge to do this topic justice. So we brought on our good friend, Johnny Labriola, to help us out. Johnny got into craft beer and homebrewing around 5 years ago, and he's since worked at a few different breweries and really just, fell headfirst into the craft beer rabbit hole. We talked about the science of brewing, that is, how to extract the good stuff from the malt, how to add various hops to beer, how fermentation works, as well as the art and skill of designing and implementing different beer recipes. That's where the fun creativity really comes in. We also got into the rich history that human beings have with beer, something that I think most people don't fully know about. And lastly, we brought it all together by tasting the same beer, Bear Republic's Racer 5 IPA. If you've never had it, it's a great West Coast style IPA. So we learned some details about how to do a formal beer tasting. It was a fun episode, and we definitely had a silly beer buzz going for it. All right, before getting to the episode, let me just remind you to check out our website where we have more and more articles going up each week. You can also sign up for our newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. We send updates as well as inspiring quotes, YouTube videos, pretty much anything else that we find on the internet and want to share with you. And if you like what we're doing here and want to support our growth, please consider making a donation through the PayPal buttons on our website. Links to that are in the episode notes. That about does it. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the episode. All right, Johnny, welcome to Exploring Kodawari.
Hello.
Thank you.
We'll get into where... Oh, you got it in cans.
Yeah.
Nice.
I'm closer to
Wait,
the source,
canned
baby.
version of it? I didn't know.
Yeah, I think there's probably... Is that a tall boy 16-ounce can? Or...
You know it.
Nice. So we're drinking it out of a bottle. I've never seen the cans here on the East Coast. We're drinking Bear Republic Racer 5. We'll get into, I think we'll do a tasting of that in a little bit. Can we first start with, how the hell did you get into beer? How long ago? Whatever version of that story you want to tell.
Sure. So it'll be real quick because the whole episode will basically cover it. I got really into craft beer 6 years ago, right before my wedding. And
you did have great beer at your wedding.
We had great beer. I spent more money on the beer than on the food.
Or the ring.
Or anything else.
Priorities.
Yeah, way more than on the ring. And it's one of those rabbit holes that you go down. I tend to do that with any hobby. I can't just make some bread or make a beer. I have to get all the fancy toys and read too much about it and just dive too deep. And when I started doing that with beer, I noticed this is an endless pool. There's no bottom to this. Mm-hmm. And you can just get as into it as you want. So I got really into the drinking of it, and then I got more interested in how it was made, and I realized it's something I could do at home. And I became definitely an obsessive home brewer. Then I started working for breweries and got into the industry a little, started bartending, and now I work in production, helping out
Nice.
At a pretty big production facility.
What was the record you set? I don't know if it's an actual record, but it certainly sounded like one when you said you brewed how many in 1 year, home brews?
Yeah, so when I first started working in breweries, it was just bartending, and I kept saying, I want to work in production. And it's weird. People that say they want to work in craft beer, they tend to get treated like people that want to convert to Judaism, where, they famously turn you away. It's one of the few religions that isn't actively trying to switch people to their side.
They're
but
not
I think
desperate.
3 times you get refused, but by the rabbi before he'll even consider it, and then it's a whole lot of work and study and all that. So that tends to happen with beer because it's mostly cleaning. It's mostly cleaning crap and working with very dangerous chemicals.
Right.
And, everyone has this idea that it's, a guitar riff while the camera pans in slow motion and a bunch of guys with tattoo sleeves and beards are dipping that long stick with the cup on the end in the tank and then pulling it out and then testing it and all just nodding at each other and looking at the bubbles. And it's that's 2 minutes out of a 60-hour week.
So many movies show it like that. You just see the brewers are just always having a beer while working too, and I'm sure that's not really a thing, right? Because
No, one, it's mostly illegal, pretty much every state. And two, it's just not safe. You're working with like big equipment and dangerous stuff, and you fuck up your chemical titrations, like you can really ruin stuff or hurt yourself.
Yeah, but that chemical can burn your skin off, right?
Oh yeah, I've gotten a few chemical burns already. But it's just any kind of physical job. If you start drinking during the day, you're gonna get tired, and it's exhausting, So I was getting that response from people that I knew, brewers and stuff, like, you don't want to do this. Like, you're bartending, you make more than me as a bartender. You make more than me bartending than I do as a brewer, they would tell me. And it's like, oh, I get to hang out in the air conditioning and talk about beer. Like, you don't get to talk to anyone. You just hear loud machines going, and you have to just get all the numbers right, or everyone blames you.
Right.
So they tried to steer me away. So I decided I was going to expose myself to as much beer as I can and see if I hated it by the end. So I did 50 batches of homebrew in a year, 50 5-gallon batches, which is just a number unless you've ever brewed before. Homebrewed, a brew day is 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, depending on the style of beer you're making. So it was pretty much once a week I was spending a whole one of my days off making beer. And the plan at the end of the year is that if I hate it, then I know not to stay in this industry. And if I was still into it, then I'm on the right track. And I was more into it at the end of the year than at the beginning. So that was a good test to do. It's like music. Like, people might think they want to be a rock star, right? But you tell them, well, practice scales every day for a month and see if you still
They're
hate
like,
it.
scales,
Still
that's
love
boring.
Right. Yeah. Or it's like, oh no, I just want to teach me smoke on the water. I want to be I want to feel like a rock star. And it's like, well,
right.
There's a lot
I got
more
the
to it.
outfit already.
So I actually made more beer, I think, than, I shouldn't say this, but more than you're legally allowed to homebrew. I think the federal limit is 200 gallons a year per adult. And I did like 250. So, but
luckily you got rid of the evidence, right?
As I was going, I never had more than like 10 gallons in the house, 15 gallons at a time. So I wasn't worried about getting pinched, but I see why they set that amount so high. It's really hard to make that much beer in a year.
And when we visited you in North Carolina at your old place,
there's always something cooking.
It was dangerous.
There's beers everywhere. Yeah.
Today
The big glass jugs you keep it in, I think I had 5 going at one point.
Yeah. I mean, it's awesome because I got to be drinking your beer while also looking at the fermenting beer under the towel.
The next night's beer or something.
Well, not quite next night's, but
2 days, whatever.
Whatever. It was cool to see the varying processes all laid out in visually. Because normally, like, if you're like I was before I thought about this at all, basically before you made me think about it, beer was what you get at the grocery store when you want to have a nice Friday night.
Right. And that's how I always thought of it. It's just like a product. Like, some people are really into food or this or that, but the cool thing about beer and any fermented beverage is it's living. Like, people tend to think of beer and treat it like it's a made good, like it's a license plate or a bicycle, but it's a living thing. Like, something they used to say all the time is brewers don't really make beer. You make wort, which is we'll get into all that, but it's this sugary mix that you hop, and so you make the wort and then you turn it over to the yeast. The yeast is what makes it beer.
Right.
Wort tastes nothing like beer, has no alcohol. I mean, it tastes a little bit, but it has no alcohol in it. It's not really beer yet until the yeast does its thing.
Is that the super sweet liquid when you've extracted from the grain?
Yeah.
I think I tasted it when I brewed with you, right?
I remember that, yeah.
It tasted like really sweet, like tea or something, right?
It's like a bready tea.
Yeah.
Is I always find it tastes like a bread, like a grainy tea.
Is that safe to drink?
Yeah.
Like if you had like a glass of it?
It is if it's fresh. The problem is if you don't put yeast in it, other bacteria, you can get botulism and some other things growing in it. But brewer's yeast is specifically designed to break down certain sugars, ferment certain sugars that wild yeasts really can't. So the part of the mash is to set those sugars up in the mash. And then once you throw your yeast in there, it's going to, even if there is some bacteria, it pretty much outcompetes it. And it's going to just spread and take over the wort. So even if you have an infected beer with, outside bacteria or whatever, it's not going to harm you.
And can you have a coronavirus beer?
I don't think any viruses can live in beer.
Yeah.
Because the pH of beer is pretty low too. So that makes it fairly safe to drink.
Right. How would you define, just for people who know beer but might not know craft beer, or have a firm category for what that means? Maybe even including myself. I know what a craft beer is, but I don't know where the line is. Is there a line, or how do you kind of define it?
I mean, there are like hard and fast definitions for it, but I don't go by those. It's more it's like anything. If you put a certain level of skill and care and knowledge and appreciation for what you're making, then you can call it craft, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what makes these craft cocktails, or what makes this a craft hot dog stand. It's like, well, he makes all the hot dog sausage.
Right.
Like he gets the tubing and makes it. Like, it's not a craft hot dog stand. It's like those are Nathan's. I just saw the packaging.
Yeah.
And that's like Walmart brand bread. It's just a hot dog then. Nothing wrong with that. But if you really he makes his own buns, he makes all the toppings. It's like, okay, those are craft hot dogs. So with beer making, I mean, there's craft breweries that put out really awful stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
You don't blame them. Some of them, because it's a business. They need to make money. Because people buy the cider, the ciders or the hard seltzers, and that's what I make my money on. Then now you're a hard seltzer brewery, though. That's half of your product going out, and the other half is beer that's not great. Like I guess you're still a craft brewery, but
that's where it gets real foggy. The idea would be, what is there a taste standard of that you have to achieve? That's really hard to enforce, right? It's more of a cultural kind of felt definition than like a specific.
I mean, I think the perfect example of a traditional craft brewing would be like the Trappist breweries, because that goes through history way more than any American beer or what we think of as craft beer. I'm sure you've heard of Trappist beers, but there's a specific definition. It has to be, I'm going to forget the order. Not Franciscan. One of those orders of monks.
Has to be made by them.
Yeah, it has to be made by them, but it has to be made by actual monks it has to be brewed on site with, I think it's ingredients mostly grown there. Like they have to grow their own grain, and they have to live a monastic lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Like they also have to sell whatever they sell has to be to raise money to help people. Their whole Christian ethic thing.
Yeah,
but
that whole thing.
That whole thing. But there's a whole tradition to Trappist brewing and their processes and stuff, and they're respected for that because they've been putting out consistently good beer for centuries.
Yeah,
and
you can bet they're careful and mindful about the brewing process because they're monks.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, that's. I'm gonna just throw random historical tidbits throughout because there's too much to just do one section of this podcast on it. But fasting is a big part in a lot of religions. Christianity used to have a lot more of it. Lent was traditionally a period where you would fast. And that order of monk, or a lot of orders of monks, it would be you could only have bread and water for the 40 days because I think that's all Jesus had when he was in the desert. Mm-hmm. So you could only eat bread and water, which is not great, and it's really bad for your health. Like there's not enough vitamin B and nutrients in bread to keep you alive for that long in a healthy manner.
Yeah.
But beer, actually, you do get a lot of those good nutrients that you need from the yeast. So they would cheat and brew beer and be like,
liquid bread.
That's bread and water. It's liquid bread. And that's where that term liquid bread kind of got popularized. But if you're not eating all day and then you have, some Belgian ales at night, like you're going to be hammered even if you only have a few.
Are you saying, I just want to have this on the record, you're saying that Jesus was hammered when he came up with the Bible type shit?
The guy's blood was wine. He was definitely hammered, right? Like
that's what happened. Oh,
I think Jesus would have been a beer drinker if he lived in a different part of the world, though. It's just wine is what was the thing in the Middle East.
Right. That was the ceremonial,
Yeah.
I mean, there might be something ceremonial to alcohol in general, which is like, when you let go of control a little bit, right? You alter your consciousness with this substance.
Mm-hmm.
Who is the more truthful version of you? People tend to not hold up their fake stuff when they're drinking, right?
There was an ancient Persian practice where they would, like, if you had a real debate about something, like let's say we're going to go to war, we're going to invade this city, I would get the king would get his counselors together and we would discuss the plan of like, not how we're going to do it, but if we should, if politically it was a good idea, why we should do it. And then we would go and get wasted and have the same argument. So the idea was you could see it sober and drunk, and you would get that. Like,
oh
well,
my
he
God,
might
we should
say-
do that with Trump and Biden for the presidential debates.
I mean, yeah, I think we should still do the mushroom thing I was saying on that other podcast. They should have to take mushrooms on the debate stage so you can really see what it's like when they freak out and be like, I don't want to give that guy the nuclear bombs.
Right, yeah. Even just one beer, though, I feel like would for both of
Loosen
them
them up
would
a little.
push them off of whatever.
Well, Trump doesn't drink. He famously doesn't drink, so.
Well, that all the more reason to force him to.
Exactly. You could use a drink or two, I guess.
How would you say getting into craft beer, like falling into a rabbit hole, either specifically beer or if it were any other rabbit hole, how has it changed your personality or your sort of, vibe?
Well, I mean, the internet just makes it amazing because any little thing I think is kind of cool, I don't have to spend all this time gathering like bits and pieces of information from different people to get a good, like someone's already done it and it's on YouTube. Like I don't have to read a bunch of books. Like bread making is my latest thing. I don't have to read a bunch of books on bread making. There's whole channels of people who did all that and have been making bread for years now.
Right.
And they give you little tips and it's true for brewing also. So I like that you could tell the breadth of a subject and see how interested and what parts you're actually interested in.
Really quickly. You don't have to go to the library and find out. It's a dead end.
Like I've tried to watch some videos I tried to get into geometry earlier in the year.
That's funny, really?
Yeah, I got some Euclid books and stuff, and I was like, oh, there's not much like actual math. It's all proofs and logic thinking. If you start this line and split it and that and this, it's not like super complex. I mean, it is, but it's
built from
stuff you can
simple
draw.
formulas or simple
all
ideas,
shapes and stuff. And I got like a chapter into the book, and I was like, I don't like this. This is too complicated. and so I was able to give up on that pretty easily.
So you circled the rim of that rabbit hole and said, no thanks, not for me.
It's a lot easier to get a glimpse at stuff and decide, I think, these days and figure out whether things aren't as... Because when I first tried to get into homebrewing like 10 years ago, it was really insurmountable. Like, everybody thought, a lot of people you talk to had been doing it for years. They're like, they couldn't answer my questions. Like, I don't know. I don't do it that way. I just do it the way I do it. Or, it's changed a lot though. And it is scary to just think, how do I do this? Cause you got to buy a lot of equipment. You have to know a lot of like specialized little steps, but also you can just throw the ingredients together and get beer.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it's how, but you can just mix water and flour and add some yeast and it'll turn into bread. But if you want a perfectly fluffy baguette with that nice crunch on that, like that takes way more skill.
And theoretically a better result unless you mess something up in that process. But
right.
I love the idea
at this point,
of as you circle the rabbit hole, your signal will get stronger, like it's worth going deeper in, and you sort of get more slack on the rope and go down deeper.
And the more I go into beer, the more I want to keep going.
Cool. That's a good sign too. And it's also a good sign that you can make that not just a hobby, but also a career path.
Yeah, like honestly, I thought at different points, I was like, maybe I should go work for like a maltster or a hop farm, or I did apply at a yeast manufacturer, even like a supplier of a brewery. Like it's really interesting stuff to me. So like any of that would, except a water treatment plant, that sounds dull. But that's the
as
other
much
ingredient.
as water is crucial to beer.
Yes. But yeah, and at this point I have enough, like I have a badass home setup now that my beer, like there's nothing limiting me from making great beer except myself. And I kind of like that,
Right.
Like if your guitar is missing a string, you're kind of limiting yourself. But once it's set up and tuned, like it's kind of on you to do a good job or a bad job.
Right. Yeah. You've got the whole like recording studio at home. It's up to you to make a good album out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's not your equipment then. It's your inspiration that's the issue.
So you invested pretty heavily in homebrew equipment. What would you say about people who are looking at those kits that, are pretty cheap? Are they worth it?
They're a great way. They are, especially if you've never done it. And like I said, you're not going to go buy hundreds of dollars worth of equipment for something you might use once, which I do know people who have had that happen and it sits in a garage and just, it's a waste of money. You're not going to make amazing beer, but you can make good beer with those kits usually.
Okay.
The one thing I do tell people when they buy it is open it up and throw the yeast out if it comes with a packaged yeast, because the yeast is the most important ingredient really after the water, I guess. And those things get packaged and they sit on a shelf in a shop for 6 months, a year. You order them on Amazon. They might be put on a truck that's 120 degrees. Like that's going to cook your yeast and kill it. And I know a lot of people who have done that. They get the kit, they follow the directions, and then it makes a funky tasting beer because the yeast is bad. And they go, I spent a whole Saturday for this crap. This isn't worth it. And then,
I must
they give
suck
up.
at brewing. Yeah.
So I would go to a homebrew store. I know those are more rare than they used to be. But if you can go to a homebrew store and if they have kits, say, I want fresh yeast with it. And if they say no, then don't, they won't. They'll, say, my friend said to get a fresh yeast and not the one with it. It's like $5 for another yeast pack. Just get one off the shelf and, or from the yeast fridge, because those tend to get sold more to homebrewers and they turn over and they're fresher.
Right. If it's in the fridge.
But definitely if you do the kit, like the first time I did a beer, it was one of those Mr. Beer kits. And it turned out bad because I did use the yeast that came with it. It turned out pretty bad, but I had so much fun making it. And there's something about drinking something you made. It's like eating a steak you cooked, versus getting one at the store. The stores or at a restaurant, theirs might be better, but there's something about it, about knowing you did it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally. Yeah.
I have a question.
So I got hooked on that, and I was like, how do I get better at this? And then I spent thousands of dollars a year on equipment and ingredients and stuff.
I have this question. What's your favorite thing about like the beer culture that you would say that makes it different than a cocktail or like wine culture?
So it's probably it's more on the industry side of it. The first thing I would say is it's probably the least pretentious out of those.
Yeah,
there are pretentious people in every hobby.
Pretentious people
but
have
beer
infiltrated
drinkers, right? But beer drinkers tend to be more like, let's hang out and have a beer.
That's
like,
true. Yeah, they don't attach anything else into it.
Right. Like if a wine people are having a tasting and someone says they taste something no one else tastes, I'm sure there's some judgment there in certain groups. And you get some of that in beer, but it's not a lot. But my favorite thing I would say is more industry driven. And it's the only industry I've worked in where competitors hang out and talk and share information.
That's
and
very
collaborate,
respectable,
right?
For sure.
Yeah, and you don't get that in, mattress companies aren't doing that, or fast food companies that CEOs aren't getting together and
check out this new
shop.
burger, a combination of McDonald's and Burger King coming together to make the most delicious. Yeah, no.
Or no, not even that. Just there's brewers will get together and just hang out and just talk about how we did this way, and we did that way. And part of it is such a complex process that it's, like good luck trying to rip us off. You can find out exactly how we make it every step of the way, and yours is probably going to be a little different than ours because you're using different equipment. You're getting your ingredients from
you're
how
a different
long is
person.
it sitting there?
Yeah,
you're a different person. Your schedule, your work schedule is different. People come in at 6 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. Like when the yeast gets like it's so hard to copy exactly. That and no one's really trying to do that. Everyone's trying to do their own thing. So you'll get competitors. The brewery I work for now, they used to have that where brewers would get together and like bring beers that they were working on. They're like, something's off, and they get feedback and like brutally honest, be like, yeah, this is bad. There's an off flavor here, and like you can't tell a fellow artist their painting sucks because that guy's hand looks weird. Like it's too subjective, But
I wish we could do that as like instrument players, get together and just roast.
I bet that wouldn't go well if you were like, it sounds weird. You should move your hand slightly. Like you can't say that to someone at your level.
Well,
right?
certainly not to a violinist.
Yeah, I mean,
you can't say you look dumb the way you hold that violin.
Yeah, I mean, we had
can't say
those
that.
settings, like masterclass settings, but it's
Johnny.
always
The only
designed
way
to be
that
fake, like and just pretend.
well, it can be fake, but sometimes it's real if the teacher running the masterclass is really good. But it has to have that hierarchy of like someone's in charge, and if you overstep and be like, I really think your Tchaikovsky concerto sucked, they're gonna be like, whoa, that's not helpful, like and they run the show. But I would love for musicians to get together and we play recordings of our own stuff and say
and critique it,
but in that healthy kind of collaborative way. Like we all have weaknesses. Maybe I'm not spotting mine. Let me know.
Yeah, and that's not like something that's manufactured or forced. Like everywhere I've lived, that's just part of the beer scene. I think it's the people attracted to it. It's a mixture of like they're mad scientists.
Yeah.
Like brewer types. Like it's just that there's a certain personality you have to be like, oh, I'll just get in there and figure it out. And when you meet other people like that, it's easier to just not take things personally, I think.
Yeah. And the larger
'cause
beer culture is very friendly, I think. Like when you go to breweries.
Also, there's no money in brewing. Brewers, there's no rich brewers.
Do you think
There's
that's
some
why it's
owners
like
of
this
breweries
then?
who are,
Because it's not
Kinda,
corrupted
yeah.
by money?
because you get into it because you care about it.
Right.
Like I took a pay cut to move to production from bartending.
Right.
Because I'm more interested in that. And like, I could make the same money working 3-4 days a week at a busy bar, but like this is much more enjoyable to me.
Yeah. I mean, you're
Having-
part of the process of actually making a beer, not just serving it. It feels probably more meaningful.
It does, yeah. It's like, our generation too, I think we crave that more, and there's not as many places, people who want to do stuff and make things with their hands. And someone like me who has no like real talent with that, like I can't craft a sculpture or, even like woodworking, carpentry, like fine skill carpentry, like I'm kind of uncoordinated for that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But like brewing is more about taking your knowledge and using it. I'm not a brewer, I should say. Like I haven't been to school. Like there's a lot of people who spend years and get scientific degrees in brewing.
Can you say what the formal education is of brewing?
So it used to be even like 20 years ago, you just got into it because there weren't a lot of programs. And they were mostly homebrewer types who made good beer who got into the business. But now it's changed since it is a huge industry. There's a lot of degree programs and there's like 2-year technical programs for brewing. There's 4-year fermentation science degrees. There's people who get PhDs and microbiologists are going to work in the labs for checking the beer for, micro infection and just really trying to dial everything in and control every step of it. So yeah, it's a lot, like especially out here in Portland where I live, you pretty much need a 4-year degree to get a brewing job.
Oh, wow. I mean, I was going to ask, is it mandatory? Like to what extent it's mandatory? Like, can you raise in the company?
Yeah,
if you
is there
don't
a
have
corporate
it?
ladder or any kind of ladder?
Well, like they would never put me on I work at a production facility now, so they're making tens of thousands of barrels a year. They would never put me in the brew house unless I went to school.
But let's say
now, this company's cool. They might pay for me to take some classes or work with me, but it's not like a state law or anything. Mm-hmm. It's just an standard, an industry standard.
I see.
But if you're going to start a small 1-barrel neighborhood bar, you might be like, I'm a chemist. Like I have a chemistry background. This is my buddy John. He homebrews really good beer. We're going to team up and, just split everything. Figure like there's people who still do that, but to step into an already functioning brewery, like it's all about consistency and control of the product. So you can't just throw someone in there who doesn't understand practices and does it all their own way.
Right.
That's another cool little thing about beer is we are deciding all the sugars, exactly what we want in the beer. But you can't do that with like wine or cider because you're getting the sugars already formed in your grapes or your apples or your fruit or whatever. Whereas with malt, you're malting, you're roasting it, you're controlling the temperature of your mash. You can add enzymes to get more or less different sugars. So that's why beer is same from batch to batch and wine has to go, it's this vintage or that vintage. And so much of it is, taking care of your grapes before, how long do you age it, blending the different barrels to get the right taste you want. And with beer, it's this should taste the same as the last one or is the same as the other one. Or this year's hops have slightly different like oil compounds or alpha acids is what they look at for bitterness. So we have to, it's slightly less. So if we add this much more, it'll be the same bitterness that we had in so you have so much of that control. Okay. You do need somebody with that scientific training.
So they measure the variance in the ingredients that come out of the ground, like where you don't know what the weather caused the plants to grow this way or that way.
Yeah.
And they try
to equalize if you're brewing a gigantic, like if you're filling a 400-barrel tank out with a 50-barrel kettle, it's going to take you 4 batches to do that, right? If your second batch is a little under, you can adjust your next 2 batches
okay.
so the whole
Gotcha.
tank is the same.
So it's like if you have over extracted coffee, the next batch you add to it can be under and it will balance out.
Right. It'll balance out.
Gotcha.
But that's not necessarily the case everywhere, though. I've been reading up on a lot of farmhouse beer, wild ales, open fermentation stuff.
Yeah.
It's impossible to make those beers the same from batch to batch if you're just letting wild yeast in. And, some places lean into it, and that's how they do it. But
That's almost
it's still the same level of
cool way to let randomness decide how your beer is going to be, right?
Yeah, if anything, like dialing in every other part of your process is more important because you're turning over such a big step to chance.
Yeah. Well, this would be a good transition into the history part since you mentioned wild fermentation and all of that.
Sure.
Let's just start.
So,
can you give a brief history of beer, like that would fit into what
So I used to always say when I gave brewery tours that, they say dogs are the oldest domesticated animal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's brewer's yeast.
Okay.
Which
Come over
is
here, little
technically
brewer's yeast, and cuddle with me on the couch.
it's technically a fungus, I know, but and if it's not first, it was right after dogs because there's a huge overlap between beer people and dog people. So I'm convinced there's something there. I don't have a time machine, so I can't prove it. But we think people have been brewing beer for about 10,000 years, and I contend that without beer, we would have developed cities. We would still be very nomadic. There's obviously the benefits of you get from alcohol drinking in a group, the whole tribe getting together and having a bowl of beer. It warms your spirit. It relaxes you.
Bowl of beer.
Makes jokes a little. Oh, yeah, that was the traditional way to drink it.
That's so funny.
Out of a bowl?
A bowl, yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have mugs. You ate everything out of a bowl back then. How many bowls did you have, when you were running from place to place? But beer really does allow us to settle down in one place. So quick human history. We're hunter-gatherers, right? We're running around. We follow the herds. We live off the land. Some hunt, some gather. When the food runs out, you move on and follow the buffalo or whatever, right? Now, then they start noticing the gatherers. If we replant some of these seeds, that we'll get more. And if we come back to the same area next season, there'll be even more of these wild grasses and stuff that we can easily pick and eat.
Yeah.
You do that long enough till you go, hey, we got a whole field of wheat here or barley growing. Like, we should just stay. But now you go, well, the buffalo left though, and we're going to die if you need meat to survive. There's I think it's vitamin B and A and something else that you get from meat that, it's hard to get on
just protein, right? Do you get enough protein from wheat?
Yeah, exactly. So, I think you can actually, but there's that problem there is, well, we want to stay here because we're investing in this land, but our food is leaving. And then you also have the problem, the grains only get harvested once a year, and we got to wait till next year to get more. They're going to go bad. They're going to get moldy. They're going to rot. So how do you keep grain from going bad?
You mean like even if they picked it all and stored it, you couldn't store it all?
Well, that's the other thing.
Over the winter.
You ever tried to bite into a piece of raw corn?
I don't think so.
You'll crack a tooth. It's so hard.
Yeah.
Like unprocessed grain is so freaking hard because it's a seed, and so you would soak it like oatmeal, or you would heat it up and soak it in water, heat it up, and it would soften it so you could chew it. It also, when you add water to malt, warm water, it causes enzymes in the actual seed that are designed to grow. I'm jumping all over.
No, go for it.
So a seed is all, like bread is all carbs, right? That's what everyone knows. White bread is all carbs. Why is that? Because a kernel of wheat is all sugars packed in there. It's a little battery for the future wheat stalk for the plant it's going to grow. And it has to have enough energy to shoot through the ground and start getting it from sunlight. So there's a lot of energy in that seed, but you want to get at it. So you soak it in some warm water. and the enzymes will actually go to work breaking these big starchy carb chains down into simple sugars that are supposed to feed the plant. Now, if you just leave it damp and wet, it will grow into a plant. That's germination. When we used to do the little paper towel thing in school.
Oh, yeah.
If you just leave it long enough, the seed will get really hard and it'll turn into a plant, and eventually the seed breaks down as it gets used up. So you get it just damp enough, and then you dry it out. So you have all these sugars lined up, and then you dry it, and it's to store it. And now that's how you make malt. So someone probably did it by accident. They left their malt soaking, put it in a basket, or they put it in a basket, it got wet, and then they dried it out, and they noticed it's sweeter now. It tastes better.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone else noticed if you take it after you malt it and dissolve it in water, it'll get foamy and bubbly after a few days. And then it tastes really good, and it gets you drunk and makes you feel great. So beer was discovered kind of by accident.
Right.
But you can replace meat in your diet with like unfiltered, low alcohol beer in large enough quantities. So boom, now we can stay in one place, right?
And we're drunk and happy.
Yeah. We're drunk and happy. We could stay in one place, and we figured out how to turn this grain, which would have taken up a huge amount of space, and put it into concentrated form in a bowl, and it's still got all those good calories in it.
So in that process that you just described, where they were doing this stuff with the wheat was left in water, and then it turned into beer.
I should say barley, not wheat.
Barley.
I just say wheat because people are familiar with it, but it was barley.
And so you're saying that some random occurrence of yeast flying through the air must have landed in that
Yes.
bowl of liquid.
There's yeast everywhere. The whole world is covered in yeast.
Yeah.
That's just something people don't realize. Like when you can make wine with just grapes by just smashing them up, and the yeast on the outside of them will ferment it.
It might not be an award-winning wine, but it'll be alcoholic slightly at least.
In fact, that's how you make sourdough. Is you just leave flour and water on your counter, and the wild yeast will start eating those sugars.
So wasn't there also the historical fact, like if you push forward from hunter-gatherer stuff into like civilization, like it allowed people to have access to clean drinking water? Obviously beer is not just water, but it's mostly water, right?
There is a saint who was known for that. He's the patron saint of beer. I'm blanking on the name, but it was because during the plague, he convinced them to here, take the beer from the brewery because we know that's safe. We'll water it down so there's enough for everybody. And we're good because they were getting plague runoff from the river from where they pulled from the next city.
Runoff.
So
that sounds awful.
But the brewers would boil their water in Europe at that time. So yeah, it was a form of sanitizing. Also, it's a way to store it. So here, I got a quote here about farmhouse brewing. But traditionally, even if you have good water, right, you have a nice clean well, and so you have workers in your field. So how do you get that water to the workers? You're going to put it in a bucket, put it in a barrel, right?
Yeah.
Well, think about a wooden barrel that is probably not brand new, right? Like how much time do you have to make brand new barrels when you're a peasant farmer? Probably an old barrel. You're going to fill it up with water and bring it out on a cart, and it's sitting in the sun all day. How long before that water gets gross and nasty and it's stagnant water? It's just sitting there. It's going to make you sick. And there's no calories in it, which when you're working in the fields all day, you don't have time to stop and eat every 20 minutes, to keep your calorie input. So just a quick draft of beer would, keep it going.
Yeah.
Energy-wise,
in fact, a lot of farmers would pay workers because you don't get paid until you sell your goods. I gotta collect my grain and go to the farmer's market and sell it. Then I pay my workers. So part of your payment was you have a place to sleep in the barn, and you get paid in beer until pay comes in, because I don't have any money. I have grain and water, so I made beer. It's another form of wealth.
So are you saying our ancestors, maybe their biological systems evolved to handle our beer-rich diet?
Oh, yeah. I think at least amongst Northern European people, there's a very high tolerance for alcohol, but also higher rates of alcoholism amongst those groups. Whereas, you go to areas like Southeast Asia or China specifically, areas of China where they've had good water for a long time, and there's like alcohol allergies are more common because it wasn't we got bad water this summer. Oh, beer makes you sick. Well, the water does too. So let's see which kills you first.
Yeah.
You have more options, but
I
here's
love
a
that.
quote. here's a quote about the 20th century, because people forget this about beer. The most dramatic and far-reaching social change of the second half of this century, and the one which cuts us off forever from the world of the past, is the death of the peasantry.
Right.
Which is true. We don't remember how important beer was to that lifestyle because it's so foreign to us. Like, nobody who in the West is really, I mean, people are food insecure, but most working people aren't worried about not getting enough calories. It's about worrying about not getting enough of the right kind or getting too many.
A balanced diet, not just surviving on to the next meal.
Whereas a lot of people, if you work on a farm, you can't afford to buy meat if you're a peasant farmer. So it's the hunter-gatherer problem again. Where do I get these nutrients? Like, you need the calories in your beer to stay alive.
Yeah.
You don't see pictures from the 1800s of fat farmers drinking their beer in the fields, and they drank beer every day.
Because they drank beer every day, but they didn't also have hot dogs and fast food and
no, they would work a 12-hour day
fries.
and then eat some porridge.
Yeah.
You know, so the beer was some of the healthiest parts of their diet.
Ironically enough, beer is probably viewed now as an unhealthy habit, but I think there is a lot of health benefits to...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would agree drinking like a Miller Lite. I'm not bashing it. I love a good Miller Lite, but you're not getting, it's pasteurized. You're not getting any of those benefits from it.
Yeah.
From those gut bio. Like, I drink a lot of unpasteurized craft beer, or even better, unfiltered homebrew, which, like if you make a Hefeweizen, like that's a yeasty beer. Like the haziness in a wheat beer in the Hefeweizen, it's actual yeast floating around in the beer.
Right.
That's what gives it that nice banana clovey kind of smell and like that chunky foamy head on it. And so like that's it, that's pretty good for your gut, I think. And my experience with fermented foods, which I'm a big fan of in general, if you eat or ingest something fermented and it makes you sick, and when people say sick, they really mean diarrhea, right? But like not physically sick, like say, oh, I think there's something wrong. No, if there was soap in it, you would have like thrown up or had renal failure or something bad. Like if they left cleaning chemicals. I've found that if fermented food has a reaction like that and gives you the bubble guts, as it's known, you probably need more of it in your diet.
Yeah.
Right.
And or you took too much at once. So if you eat a bunch of kimchi and it makes your stomach bad, try eating small amounts over a period of a few weeks, and you'll build up a tolerance, and you'll start to. I think there's other benefits with hunger, crave.
Totally. I mean, all that gut health thing is like the new thing right now.
I find it affects my skin. I don't have great skin. I got the Irish skin in my family, and I didn't inherit the Italian side, olivey skin like my brother. So, like, I notice when I am drinking like kombucha and eating kimchi and like homemade sauerkraut and stuff, my skin is just better. It's not itchy and stuff.
Your gut is replaced by the good type of bacteria, basically. And if you don't have that enough, of course, you're gonna get initially a reaction, which is a diarrhea.
Right.
So
People go as far as to analyze their poop. They mail in their poop so that they can figure out what's going on in my gut, and maybe I need to...
I did that when I was a teenager. I had a lot of stomach problems, and they were like conditional allergies that I ended up fixing. You're like, oh yeah, you're the weirdo that I tell this story about.
No, I remember you used to have a lot of allergies, and we had lunch together, and you would you'd just be very conscious about what you're eating, basically.
Yeah, and eventually I reintroduced stuff and I built my gut back up, which is not what like the Western medicine approach was at all. It was just avoidance. Well, don't eat those things.
Yeah, you're allergic.
I came back being allergic to milk, soy, eggs, and wheat. And it's like, that's everything.
Yeah,
like,
I had a similar
things.
history. Yeah, when I was a kid, they did that. And then I was allergic to like the, yolk of the egg, but not the white of it. Like just all kinds of awkward things like cockroach eggs, something like that.
What?
Yeah, that was a thing.
Cockroach eggs?
Yeah, I was allergic to cockroach eggs.
How do you know that?
I don't know. They just like stuck needles all over my body.
Is that one of the needles they stick you with? The cockroach egg needle?
No, apparently like
maybe in Turkey it is. I don't know. They might have more of a problem than I do.
Specifically cockroach eggs, I guess, or like cockroaches. Like
I'm gonna let that one slide.
Anyway, like it's all bullshit. I think.
Well, they probably lay a lot of eggs for how tiny they are. So if you have a few, I could see that being a problem.
If they're just around the house and like you pick up your keys and you got some cockroach eggs on your hands.
Honestly, I think it's all bullshit.
Then you eat some chips.
Like along with hundreds of other things in that list. So what I'm trying to say is...
you just did what I did with like milk products. You just slowly expose yourself to cockroach eggs until you're comfortable with them.
I ate them and now I'm okay.
There's the soundbite of the episode.
Now you're fine. But like people who say they get beer shits, I've heard that, and it's like, oh man, I can't drink those wild ales. It gives me beer shits. It's like, okay, that's one thing. Someone goes, oh, I can't drink Miller Lite. It gives me beer shits. It's like, no, it was the 3 chili cheese dogs you had with the 17 beers. Like, that's a bad combination. I would like to see more of the like 3 to 5% beer range. There's a French style called a grisette that I really like, and it's named after the type of like gray drab smocks the women would wear in the 1800s in France. And it's like a kind of a funky farmhouse beer, but it's like I've had some at like 2.5%, 3%.
Right.
And like those are your everyday drinking beers. I'm not talking about the double IPAs. Like that's probably, I mean, I do drink those every day too, but you're not going to get the same medicinal benefit as from those low alcohol, those, and it's good in some ways because, a 2% beer, it's still somewhat diuretic, right? So it flushes the water through you, which is good if you're drinking it with other water. Like you go for a run and then have one light beer like that, it helps. You just sweat out a bunch, you drink a bunch of water, and then now you're passing that water. It kind of helps the filtration process and keep things moving.
Yeah. It's important to keep liquids moving through your body, sweating and drinking a lot of water. Would you say that the beer that as beer was evolving, they were probably these wild fermented like beers were probably 2 to 3%, something like that?
No, actually, it was probably. It depends where you look. Like there's a style in Eastern Europe called the kvass, Kvass, and typically you would take old bread, and then throw it into the water and dissolve it and brew that. Once the bread went stale, or you would actually bake these loaves with extra yeast in them, these really yeasty like rye bread cakes, and then you would just crack those up and dissolve them into water and make that into beer. So some of those kvasses are like 1%.
Oh God. Can you even taste that? Is that like under the limit where you taste the alcohol bite?
You can taste it. Well, you don't taste the alcohol bite, you taste the sourness. They're very sour because you're not producing enough alcohol to kill off everything else, and you're not, there's not enough sugar for the yeast to really outcompete the other bacteria like lactobacillus and things that will sour it. But it's kind of nice. It's better than just drinking water all day, having a little tart kind of bready drink that is nutritious and safe to drink. So it's actually sold more like a soda in certain parts of like Russia and stuff. Like they don't ID you for buying kvass even if it's 2%.
Or same with kombucha, right?
Yeah, I was gonna ask. Kombucha has alcohol, right? Mm-hmm. But is it like almost undetectable, or like if you say, let's say,
I mean, kombucha is a new thing. It's in a gray area because that has live yeast in it, but then they also add sugars for flavoring. So, like, if you ever get one, like a store-bought one, and you open it and it's foaming everywhere, it's probably higher alcohol than it says on the label because it's fermenting in the bottle, producing all that extra CO2, and that's where all those extra bubbles are coming from. So you got to be a little careful. If it's like some will say now could be up to 5% because they're like, well, technically, if it re-ferments fully, it could be
that's
that
a
much.
Beer, basically.
Yeah, because you see people driving
I
around.
That shit when I'm driving, like I don't know.
Yeah, and it's usually fine, but it's in a weird area. If you saw someone drinking a Bud Light, even if they're just having one while driving, you'd be like, "That's not right."
Yeah.
Something
exactly.
jumps out.
Like for example, a cab driver on Halloween, you'd be like, "Hey man, why are you drinking that Bud Light?"
Right. Whereas if he's drinking a kombucha, you're like very health conscious. Very good of you.
Same buzz. Well, this should be a good time to drink our beer, like taste it, and just kind of talk through how do you taste a beer if you're in the. We went to. Do you remember we came with you in North Carolina to your homebrewers meeting?
We did, and we went through a beer tasting.
Yeah,
there.
so we've done that, but that was 2 years ago. So just kind of like walk us through a brief version of how you might taste this beer.
So I'm gonna pull up the style guideline, which you don't have to do this, and but if you're trying to get into tasting beers, it's a good thing to do. There's something called the BJCP guidelines, the Brewers Judge Certification Program. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to judge a beer competition, national, international, whatever, like a professional competition for breweries, not homebrewers, although they have homebrew ones too, but this is the guideline they use, the actual, what they call an IPA. This is what they go by, not what you think it is, or because styles change and adapt.
Yeah,
the IPA in America is very different than the ones developed in England.
Definitely, yeah.
Even our stouts are very different than what the Irish drink. Guinness is different in America versus Ireland. It's like over a whole % higher here than it is there, I'm pretty sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if the market research made them, change it up to better suit
I think it ships better, too.
Oh, I see. Alcohol. That's true, yeah.
But Guinness in Ireland is like 4.5%, I think, 4%. It's pretty light. It's like 90 calories. Like you just have a couple after work. But so there's categories for each style, and there's the impression, which kind of just gives you some history about it. Decidedly hoppy and bitter, moderately strong American ale, modern American or New World hops. The balance is hop forward, clean fermentation profile. That means not a lot of yeasty flavor. Dryish finish, clean supporting malt, allowing a creative range of hop character to shine through. And then it goes into specifics: aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel. Those are, and then taste. Those are like your 5 things you want to look for.
Which is so different than how most people judge beer just initially. They'll just sip it and be like, what's the impression it leaves me? And that's fine. But this is breaking it up into a more mindful process where you're like separating categories out and trying to specifically notice them.
So the first thing we'll do is, first thing you do is look at the style. This is an IPA, Bear Republic's Racer 5 India Pale Ale.
Mm-hmm.
Quick history on IPA, and then we'll get into it. IPAs are ales. Ale refers to the kind of yeast that's used. There's 2 kinds. There's ale yeast and lager yeast. Most ale yeasts are top fermenting. Most lagers are bottom fermenting. It's just where the yeast hangs out in the tank, on the top or the bottom.
And that's not because they're forced to hang out there. It's where they naturally hang out?
No. It's where it has to do with what temperature you're fermenting at and the species of yeast, et cetera.
Okay.
So IPAs are usually top fermenting ales that in America they tend to have a pretty caramelly malt profile.
Mm-hmm.
They actually use a type of malt called caramel malt or crystal malt, where they sort of stew it in its own sugar during the malting process, so you get that caramelization instead of fermentable sugar. Because once you burn that sugar and caramelize it, it's burnt. The yeast can't eat it the same way it can uncaramelized.
It will stay in the mix as it is caramelized, not like get transformed by the yeast.
Yeah, it's basically a bone in your steak or your ribs. Like you'll eat all that meat off the bone, but like the bone is there. Like it's going to be left behind.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But we want that in certain malts. So you add caramel malts is really common in American IPAs, and that's because hops impart a lot of bitterness. So it's all about balance. You want that balance between bitter and sweet so that it's nice and pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've all had like a super sweet cider where you're like, oh, that's hard to drink. It's like drinking juice or a soda. In fact, that's why soda is so highly carbonated. You get that carbonic bite. CO2 goes into solution when you force it into a liquid as carbonic acid and acidifies it, and you get that acidy tang. That's why seltzer water has that little tang to it. Even though unflavored seltzer, it's that acidity that you're getting out of it.
As long as it's not the kind of seltzer where they add sodium. A lot of times they add.
Yeah, they cheat.
Yeah, probably because.
But
it's
even
cheaper.
if you just make it at home. You just make it at home yourself. I don't bother because I'd rather beer, but I can just fill up one of my kegs with water and hook up my CO2 tank and make seltzer.
Right.
And that's a good way to, do it in a soda stream if you have one at home. That's a good way to get what I'm talking about with that CO2 bite.
Yeah.
All right, so IPA. So we got, first thing we're going to do is look at it, right? We poured it. We're going to look at it. I like to give it a little swirl and look at the foaming. You can tell a lot by the bubbles. If you have really irregular bubbles, like all different sizes all over the place, like a non-persistent head, they did like when you pour a Bud Light into a glass, the bubbles are gone almost immediately, right?
Sure, yeah.
That makes the beer last longer in the can, but it takes away from the aroma, the presentation. It'll go flat faster. Beer is fascinating because it's really the only true foamy beverage. I know you foam up milk for your espresso or whatever, but that's kind of cheating.
You're literally just like putting air into milk in the moment. So yeah,
right.
This came out of a bottle that was probably bottled. I'm guessing we bought this in New York. This is from California. Yeah. When do you think this was bottled? Like 6 months ago?
Hopefully not.
4 months ago?
Less than 6 months, I would say.
Okay.
But Yeah, but so when you open the beer and pour it, the CO2 escaping actually, it has to do with the protein that you get out of the barley, that you get out of the malt. Wheat has it too, but it's the proteins that cause the foaming. It's the same reason milk is probably the next best foamy beverage because all the protein in it.
Right, yeah.
The fats and the proteins. But it actually creates a blanket of bubbles on top of proteinous bubbles that help keep the CO2 in. And if you pour a soda next to a beer, the soda goes flat way faster. And soda is carbonated at a much higher level than beer.
Yeah.
Beer's at about two atmospheres of carbonation. Soda can be 4.
Is that a standard in
just
beer, or do you carbonate
Pretty
differently
much.
based on preference?
Different styles are different. Like a really carbonated stout is not going to be great.
Yeah.
You want a lower carb, whereas like a Pilsner or higher carb, it's such a light beer, refreshing beer. You want that carbonation tang to it. So it's the foam actually helps. It helps release the aroma because it helps that the CO2 escaping helps gas off those aromatics from those hops, but it also keeps some CO2. It keeps it from gassing off too fast, so it doesn't go flat before you finish your beer.
So it traps a little bit, and it actually launches them into your nose. Especially, I've noticed when I fresh pour a beer, if I smell it right when the foam is like active, then you really smell it.
And that's, because it's actively the bubbles are popping. That's why I always tell people to pour certain styles you want to pour into a glass. Like a Miller Lite, drink it right from the can. It's delicious. But an IPA, definitely get a clean glass, and pour it in.
A clean glass. I love how you have to say a clean glass.
Well, that's important. Have you ever poured a beer in a glass and there's all see, look at this. There's no bubbles on the side of my glass, right?
Uh-huh. Oh, so when there are bubbles on the side, it's because it's clinging to like shit.
Dirt, grease, oil. And restaurants, it's usually just grease because a lot of places throw them all in the same dishwasher. If you go to a craft bar that doesn't serve food and there's bubbles on the side, that's a bad sign because they should only be putting beer glasses in their dishwasher. And that's another reason you don't want to put your glasses in the freezer. Because
that was before we hit record. I pulled out these glasses from the freezer, and Johnny's like, "Ooh, you made your first mistake of the episode."
So the condensation that forms in there is going to water down your beer.
That makes sense.
The most freezers aren't totally clean. I'm not saying yours isn't, but
ours is probably not clean.
But yeah, so who knows? If you got shrimp in there that's not sealed up great, like you got shrimp condensate
from through Skype.
Oh yeah, I see everything. You have you got some shrimp ice in your beer glass now, and also you don't taste as much at extreme temperatures, like super cold or super hot. We've talked about this before. Like coffee that you brew hot and then let cool down, you'll taste much more. And same thing, if you pour a beer ice cold and let it warm up, you'll be able to taste more from it.
So what would you say is the ideal temperature for an IPA like this?
IPA, well, since this is a little higher alcohol, it's probably going to take you a little while to drink it. So I would pour it at like 40 degrees. And then I'd probably finish it by the time it gets up to 50. So somewhere in that range. And
it's exactly like coffee, except the inverse, right? Because when you have piping hot coffee, it just burns your mouth. You can't actually taste it. Yeah. And then there's about a 15-minute window where you can taste it perfectly, and then it will drop off really quickly and become acidic and when tepid. It gets colder and tepid. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, but the other thing is CO2 stays in solution better at cooler temps. That's why when you open a warm can of beer, you get foam, even if you didn't shake it.
Right.
Or if you kind of shake a super chilled can, it won't foam up that much.
And you want the majority to stay in solution. That's why you were saying the blocking thing is so important.
You don't want it to go flat before the end. So that's why I tend to pour my styles a little colder and then let them come up to temp, especially in the summertime. I'll pour a little colder. But like cask ales and stuff, those get served in the 50s, and I love that flavor.
Look at the foam.
I've also had beer at 36 degrees. Nice. Is delicious too.
Hey, which one is this again?
Same beer. Oh,
really?
I just.
But I keep my kegger. I keep my keezer at 40 degrees.
Okay, I mean that makes sense because like if you have a glass of beer, you want it to taste good throughout the life of the beer, and you have to compromise at some point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's actually taste this beer now. We're just looking at it.
By the way, we've been tasting this beer.
We've been just like,
we're 2.5 years in.
They don't need to know that. There's no video.
Okay.
The next step would be to smell the beer. the aroma, right? And there's different types. There's the long sniff, the short sniff, the close sniff. Like there's where you put your nose right in it and you kind of draw slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's where you put your nose right in it and you do a quick short.
There's one that
There's the kind that Yanka just did, which
you don't want to. Yeah, you don't want to
beer.
actually snort the beer.
Yep.
But your olfactory is it's a series of tubes, if you will, in your face.
I will go on.
And you get different aromas based on those different things. Another thing to do with a very aromatic beer is if you hold it and cover it with your hand and kind of swirl, and if you're holding it with hold the glass with one hand and put your other hand on top, your body heat will kind of warm up the beer a little bit and trap some of those aromatics in there. And then you kind of put your nose and lift the hand after, 30 seconds.
Actually, that really worked.
Yeah.
Even just the 10 seconds I did,
You
I
made
got
a
like a
difference.
full profile of the smell.
Well, because it's actively gassing off. So you trapped some of those
Yeah. More concentrated.
volatile hop
I don't know the
aromat. That's
language.
the other thing. Hops are a very odoriferous plant, flower.
Yeah. If you've never smelled hops, I remember when I was at your house, Johnny, you had a bunch of hops in your freezer. And even smelling frozen hops, like you get your nose up to there, it's like, oh, whew. Like,
Yeah,
they're
they're actually
pungent.
They're a first cousin to cannabis.
Interesting.
And they're the only first cousins in that branch of whatever. I don't know genuses and stuff that well, unless it's beer
King
related.
Philip's cousin ordered fish gut soup. That's all I have to say about genuses.
That's right. Yeah, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
But they're actually first cousins, which makes sense. Cannabis is very stinky, and hops are very aromatic. So it's actually the oils in hops that produce those aromatics, and they're very volatile, which means they don't last very long.
Yeah.
So in an IPA to get that, but they also give you your bitterness. So it has to do with when you use them in the process. So since they're oil based, they won't go into solution in your beer, which is 90-something% water.
Yeah.
By just throwing them in there, because oil and water famously don't mix.
Yeah.
We all know that. You won't get any of that bitterness by just throwing hops in your beer. You have to have them isomerization is the term, and it's where you throw them in the boil, and that high heat breaks them down so that they can go into solution, and then they come across as bitterness. So that's a reason why you always boil not always, but why you almost always 99% of the time people are boiling their wort. Or boiling their beer as part of the process. It's not just to clean it and sanitize it, which is important, but it's also that's when you add your hops.
It also
takes
makes
about
your house smell
an hour.
amazing, right?
Amazing. But it takes about an hour to get like full utilization of your hops. After that, it's diminishing returns. You've gotten like 80-something% utilization out of them. And then the second hour, you get like up to like 82%. So it's like, it's not really
Right.
Most boils are about an hour.
But it's not even like you necessarily want to extract 100% from your hops. I know with coffee, the magic number is around 20%. When you extract 20% of the soluble material in the coffee bean, that's perfect. And anything more than that, you start to get off flavors that don't add to your balance of flavor.
So that's the other thing too. It's a plant, so we don't want to leave it in there forever. It'll start rotting like a rotten flower. So you throw it in the boil, and that's where you get your bitterness from. But that's not where you get this wonderful aromatic hop smell that's coming off this glass.
Okay.
You get that from dry hopping, which is a confusing term. But that's when the beer's pretty much done.
Yeah.
So we do our mash, right? We do our boil. Then we cool the wort down, which you got to do quickly. It's another reason I'll tell you later. You got to cool the wort down. Then you add your yeast. Then the yeast does its job. It could take a few days, a few weeks. And pretty much when it's done or almost done with that process, that's when you throw a whole boatload of hops into the fermenter. And they kind of just cold steep like a tea leaf. And that's where the oils get extracted. And that's why you don't get that bitterness. You just get that nice rich aroma. That's where that silky, oily mouthfeel from IPAs on your tongue come from, that nice soft smoothness. Those are those hop oils.
So it's very much a wet hop, even though it's called a dry hop.
Well, wet hop is when you use... Dry hop is when they use the little pelletized hops, because it's a plant. So they chop them up and press them into pellets and vacuum seal them.
Right.
So they'll last all year. So they're a dried form of hops. Wet hop is where you use the cones, usually picked the same day, and throw them right into the...
I see. I totally had a misunderstanding in my mind then. I thought wet hop was when you throw them in the boil and dry hop was when they're not.
No, those are called boil hops. That part makes sense. Or bittering hops. Yeah, wet hopping is and dry hopping have to do with how the hops have been processed. They're pretty much at it. They both get wet. It's going in beer,
Yeah, I mean,
it's a confusing. But beer developed over centuries. Different cultures came up with different things to contribute. So it's got a lot of weird terms like that that are specific, and like we use a different scale than the English used to use. We use Plato. They use specific gravity. Then they were using a scale called Balling for alcohol levels, and it's a weird thing in beer. But yeah, so that's where this aroma. And how would you describe the aroma in this beer?
It's hard to tell. See, I don't have the language to it.
I definitely don't have the language. I mean, Yanka definitely has less language than I do, but I feel like I have bad beer language still, even though I've been drinking it for 10 years very passionately. Let me see.
I don't know what IPAs. Like the first thing I say is it smells like flowers, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I smell some kind of like piney kind of vibe too.
Okay. So there's another cool thing about hops is they're very dependent on where you grow them to get those smells to develop. I mean, think about cannabis. There's so many different types. Same thing with hops. But I can take a hop that is really like floral, you said.
Yeah.
And it's really floral. Let's say it's from Oregon. They grow it here, and it's got that really floral smell. If you take that hop and go plant it in New York State, you might get a totally different smell. If you take it and plant it in New Zealand, you'll get a totally different profile, even though it's the same genetics. And so that's a cool thing about it. But you're right. Floral and, did you say fruity? No.
I said piney, I think.
Piney. Okay. So those are the three real descriptors for New World or American hops, and most of the hops in America come from the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah,
it's just the weather here; they grow really well. But American hops are defined by their floral, kind of fruity, and piney character. If you go over to Europe, like English hops, they tend to be much more earthy. I think like English brown ales, and if you have ever had a traditional English IPA, their dry hops are very different.
We had one in London. Would you say that matches up somewhat analogous to the old world, new world, like wine categorization?
Well, no, because it's different. Even like German hops and Czech hops tend to be more like spicy and like peppery.
Oh, okay, so it's more even specific to specific regions. Okay,
yeah, like New Zealand hops are different than Australian, and they have to grow in a certain band though. I think it's like 40 to 45 degrees latitude, but same for both hemispheres. So you can grow hops in Oregon and New Zealand more easily than Florida.
Sure.
Or Southern California, which you would think is closer, but you need a very specific climate, soil, everything. Hops are really hard to grow. They take a lot of water and a lot of care. But yeah, this beer, it's Columbus and Cascade, I believe I looked up before, are the two main hops. They're from up here, Pacific Northwest. Cascade is one of my favorites. It's a very classic American craft hop.
Yeah.
It's got that. It can be either really floral or a little fruity, depending on how it was grown. But mostly, it's very floral hop.
For people who don't know, you can actually just go on Google and type in like a hop plant, and you can see the actual plant that these things are. I didn't realize this, even though I was into beer. I had to actually realize maybe like 5 years ago that like hops are plants, and they form these beautiful little flowers. You've probably even seen the hop flower on a label of some kind as a decoration.
You might have seen them growing outside of breweries, depending on where you live.
Yeah.
A lot of them out here have them growing up the sides of the buildings. But yeah, they look like little green, they look like pine cones made out of leaves.
Yeah.
Pretty much. They're tiny little green pine cones. And if you ever take one and crack it open, there's this sort of yellow powder in there. And that's called the lupulin powder. And that's where all those nice aromatics hang out. And that's like those cryo hops. You see the cryo beer or whatever is the new craze. That's where they basically process the hops to get all that powder off of it, so you don't get any of the vegetal leaf matter.
Just the lupulin powder?
Just the lupulin. It's basically like hash from hops.
Right.
Hash is made by getting the powder off of cannabis and mushing it into and processing it into hash. is basically hop keef.
I think I've had a lupulin beer from other half at some point in the past.
Probably.
Yeah.
I think it gets overused, the ingredient. I don't think people have figured out how to use it well yet, really, but that's a whole other episode. So we're tasting it, right? We smelled it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did we taste it yet? No, we smelled it. Let's taste.
All right. Let me take another sip. This is my first sip of beer for the whole episode.
Now, another great thing about beer tasting over wine tasting is you're not supposed to spit out beer. I mean, you can. Some people do if they're doing like testing a lot of different beers, but because of that carbonation effect, you get more taste from the gassing off as it, in the back of the throat, from your olfactory, from
as you
the
swallow
carbonation. It. So you kind of have to swallow it to get the full effect of it. And another great thing about beer and carbonation is the carbonation kind of scrubs your tongue, your palate a little bit. So like that's why really light, high carbonated beer is great with hot wings. Because you eat a hot, spicy wing that is arguably too much flavor at once. Like a spicy barbecue wing. Like it's sweet, it's spicy, it's physically hot, it's got that meaty, it's greasy, it's breaded, all these stuff at once. And then you take a nice cold sip and it kind of like scrubs your palate with those bubbles.
Yeah.
It literally will scrub the spiciness off. And then it sets you up and you go, I kind of want to burn my mouth again on another hot wing.
I'm ready to go.
That nice speedballing that makes a meal great.
Mm-hmm.
So we tasted it, right? And what do we get taste wise from it? You want to let it touch all parts of your tongue, and then swallow and exhale a little bit.
I definitely get the first hit is the carbonation, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then you get that kind of floral, the smell, impacts the taste a lot, right? Those floral, hoppy.
Yeah.
You taste it too. You get that nice smoothness I was talking about from those hop oils. It's not dry or astringent at all on the tongue. It's just nice and it glides right over into the back of the throat.
Yeah, the oils for sure. I've been getting into making old fashions recently, and I always finish by squirting the citrus rind and getting the oil on top. And you get that same kind of oily, like almost like it's like an encasing for the flavor you're about to taste. It's just like the sort of context that your brain can wrap around the flavors that are about to happen.
I'm curious about like how to label. I'm sure bitter is not the right word. It's probably like an insulting word. Is it? I don't know. But how do you label that bitterness? Like, do you call it bitterness? Is that a bad thing?
Yeah, and then it's that there's that after the sweetness from those caramel malts kind of wash away, you get this lingering bitterness on the tongue, right?
And I really enjoy it, but I wasn't sure if it's like not something that.
If it's just you enjoying the pain of bitterness.
No, you are. That's what I was talking about. That's why you have to add the hops during the boil. If we didn't add any in the boil and we only did the dry hop, you would not have that bitterness. It would just be very sweet from those caramelly malt and then the hop smells. But it would be unbalanced because you need that bitterness. The bitterness is the backbone of this style.
Yes.
And it's why beer is such an acquired taste. Most people don't enjoy their first beer because it's super bitter. And bitterness in general is bad in nature. Like animals don't like bitterness and sourness. Like give your dog a lemon and watch what happens, because it usually means something poisonous. Like certain metals, heavy metals and like alkaloids and things can be really bitter. Like arsenic, I think is bitter. Like certain like naturally forming cyanide, like a lot of poisons are. So we are naturally designed to not like that flavor.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of go against your training, your evolutionary training to build up that appreciation for bitterness.
Definitely.
Which is, I used to say on my beer tours too, I tell people, so next time your wine friends complain that the beer's too bitter, you tell them their palates aren't as evolved as yours. And then watch them take that with
cool vibe of the beer culture.
Oh my God.
No. The wine fans take it with grace and humility. They don't get upset or anything, indignant.
Yeah, because I get a lot of pleasure from that bitterness. Like the more I explore, especially the IPAs. I mean, I was just not sure if it's the wrong language to use to call someone.
No, in fact, they measure it in the amount of these. It's called alpha acids, or what give you your bitterness that dissolve into the boil kettle, are measured in what are called IBUs, which stand for International Bittering Units. So
that's what IBU is? I've seen that before. I didn't realize that.
No, nobody knows what they are. I when I bartended and like people would see them on the menu, like I've heard people say everything wrong. Like their friend would be like, "What's an IBU?" And their other friend would just confidently be like, "Oh, that's the alcohol level."
Right.
Or people would be like, "Oh, what are the IBUs on this beer? Like I need, it has to be at least this much or I'm not going to be interested." And that would bother me too, because it's like, well, if I have a low IBU but very low sweetness from my malt, it's going to be in balance. If I have really high IBUs without that balance, it's going to be awful. So people will be like, "Oh, it's got to be a high IBU." It's kind of meaningless, you know?
Yeah. Well,
It's like
any one dimension
have
is
to be
meaningless,
big.
right? You need the
Well,
whole
it's like
profile.
saying it's like saying my steaks have to be huge. It's like, well, it should be cooked well. Like you shouldn't. Well, no, it's got to be 17 inches across, or I'm not eating the steak. It's like makes no sense to use that.
That's
metric.
a dimension that doesn't make sense by itself. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think with this beer, I think I love it now. If I were to taste it, if I were to go back in time and give it to my 21-year-old self, I don't think I would have liked this beer. I found this beer actually in San Francisco. I was at a 2-week Bach festival there, staying in this house by myself, beautiful house, and Trader Joe's was right across the street, and they carried this beer. And I probably went through 2 6-packs of this over the 2 weeks, and it was the classic, like I had one beer, I was tired from the whole day of like busyness, and I would get sleepy after the one beer, but every day as I'm on the way home, I'd be like, "Oh, I can't wait to crack open that Racer 5." And it's kind of like imprinted a sort of memory to that, like relaxing at the end of the day. It's sort of emotionally like imprinted in my brain that way. But I guarantee you, if you gave that to me when I first started beer, I would have been like, "This is disgusting." So bitter.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. Like those beers that we think of as, once you do dive down the craft beer rabbit hole, people think of Bud Lights and Miller Lights and Coors Lights as like flavorless, right?
Yeah.
You're like, "Oh, those are just, it's piss water." I've heard people call them all. And I'm only going back to the big three just because that's what most people know about beer.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't spend that much time thinking about macro beer, but whatever. So those beers, though, if you gave, like, I remember having my first one of them at like 16, 17, and I thought it was super bitter, right?
Right.
There's still something beery about it to the uninitiated. That's like, whoa, what is this? I'm used to sodas out of a can. This isn't what that tastes like.
Yeah.
And, but you get used to it, to now that if I gave you a warm, like, and that's the other thing, Coors brags cold as the Rockies. That's so that you don't taste it. And you don't taste that.
Yeah.
You have to let those beers get flat and warm up to room temp to get any of that hop bitterness to notice it. And then you're like, "Oh, there it is. Like I can taste it a little bit." Because there's so little malt in it. They put so little bitterness in it. Because it's got to be balanced. It's all about balance.
But if you have 7 Coors Light as cold as the Rockies, you'll be happy, I guess.
You'll be great. You'll be crushing it.
I mean, it's important not to get judgmental about like the beer. You know what I mean? Like that's definitely a thing. I've when I first was getting into craft beer and I brought specific beer to a party, people would be like, "Oh, Luke's showing up with his special beer. He can't just have our Heineken or something." And I'd be like, "Fuck off. Like, give me a Heineken. I'll drink it." Like, that's not the point. I'm not being judgmental. It just happened to enjoy this beer more, where I could have 3 of these.
We know how you feel about Heineken, Luke.
On the question of like brewing and designing recipes and all of that stuff, whether it's home brewing or for a actual brewery, would you say brewing is more of a science, more of a craft, or more of an art, or some kind of blend of all three?
Well, I would say it's to relate it for you. I would say it's like music. It's definitely, there's an art to it, and that's where the skill lies. But if you don't have the background rooted in the hard science of it, you're limiting yourself, right? Like, you could just, even a prodigy, if they just pick up an instrument and are amazing at it, like they should still study and train and do all that, right?
Yeah, the difference between the conservatory trained person and the I taught myself at home, how to play jazz or something.
Right, but even like Mozart got traditionally trained on how to write.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I know he used to, from what I know about like writing for like a big orchestra, is you write all the parts, right? Like you have your highs, mids, lows, just to keep it simple, because this is a beer cast, not a music cast. I'm an idiot.
Fair enough.
But like your flutes are up here high, and you have to line them up with the drums and the tubas and everything so that it's in harmony. And I think it was Mozart that he would just be able to write a whole line. Like he would write the violin part, and then he would write the flute part, and then he would write, like he could do it that way because he heard the rest of it.
Yeah, he had the whole big picture in his mind as he wrote. He
didn't have to write each one out to see where it went, but he knew that's how it worked before he could like abandon that style of doing it and do it his own way.
Yeah.
So I would say it's the same thing for, like a good brewer who's done it long enough. They know what an IPA recipe looks like.
Yes.
So
yes.
But they can also play with it and say, I'm going to use this ingredient that no one's ever put in an IPA because I understand the structure of it and how it works.
So the phrase you just said, I'm going to play with it. I think that's where the art lies, right? The craft is in the I know what an IPA is and what standards I have to do in the chemistry, blah blah blah. The art is in that randomness that you allow into the process. That sort of like in cocktails, you know how they say 3 dashes of bitters? Mm-hmm. Guess what a dash is? It's just it's the subjective feeling of making a dash come out of the dash bottle. And they've actually measured that and said, okay, we got the top guy in the world to like do dashes, and we figured out it's exactly like 41 dashes equals 1 ounce of bitters. It's like, great.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do behind the bar with that knowledge? Like, I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3 and do it by feel. So there's always this element of randomness or just, lack of control, I think, that is involved in art. You have all your structure, your recipe, your science, and then something you have to throw in to take a risk.
I would say for beer, it's more the structure is in like the actual day of. Like when you sit down to write the recipe, like your decisions have to be made. Like that's when you do the fun. When you get to the brew day, like you know exactly how much of each you're putting in,
And then you're just following what you've come up with, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
When you sit down to write it, you're like, this guy has a bunch of blueberries and we have these hops that I think would complement that well. How do I make this work? Mm-hmm. And like, that's the playing part. But then you run all the numbers and it works. That's the cool thing about beer though. Like there are metrics like music, like you can say whether something's in tune or not, but whether it's good or not is very subjective, right?
You can be perfectly in tune and not good.
You're perfectly on tune. Your tempo is perfect. Everyone's in, but it's just not a good piece of music.
Yeah.
Like you can have a beer that's perfectly, crystal clear and perfectly made, and the lab says it's great. There's no bacteria, there's no contamination or infection, and it's a shitty beer. Like that's just a subjective thing. And there could be a beer that goes, no, this is a perfect beer, and you could say, no, I think it's shit.
Right.
And so, like that's,
and we all know that too. Like if you advertised a beer to me and said, oh, it came back from the laboratory with pristine like results, I'd be like, yeah, how does it taste though? Tell me as a human.
Yeah, I'd be like, it's like, there's wild ales that would make all the lights start flashing because it's just full of funky bacteria and stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's like, or sours, sour beer. Like there's one of the oldest beer like writings is from Egypt. And it's like a toast, like a cheers kind of a blessing. And it was something like, may your bread always rise and your beer never turn sour.
Uh-huh.
And it's because yeast is not something you could control that well in ancient Egypt.
Right.
So it was like, I hope those go well for you as uncontrollable things. But now there's breweries that specifically only make sour beer because that's what people want.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Whereas before it was something like, oh man, it went sour.
As a negative thing, yeah.
Because it just happened. Because it's not something you could control, so you didn't want it. Now that we can control it and sour things precisely, it's a flavor people seek out. So it's like that's what makes it what makes a beer a good beer too. Do people love it? Then that's why Miller High Life's a great beer.
Yes,
who doesn't love that beer?
I mean, that's the same with music.
Wings.
Like, how does music evolve and styles of music evolve? And there will eventually be a category of beer that emerges as a distinct category that doesn't exist right now. The question is, who will take the risk
hazy
to
was the
discover
latest,
it?
I think, right?
What the hazy?
Hazies were considered bad. Like going back hundreds of years, people were trying to make clear. It's from when glasses became common, like a few hundred years ago, a couple hundred.
Yeah.
Clear, getting beer as clear as possible. What was the arms race?
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like 10 years ago, not even 20, like 10 years ago, it switched and everyone was just the haze craze, it was called. Everyone wanted hazy beers.
See, what I love about that is humans are just weird. We set rules and we think they're real rules, and then when
we are weird, we love bitter. You're killing us. Why does Yanka love bitterness? I do too.
I mean,
we burn things and inhale the smoke on purpose for the effects of it.
Yeah, it's true.
Or just because it feels nice, like hookah. You're not even getting high from it. People just like to breathe smoke.
It's true.
Like why?
I mean, Yanka grew up in Istanbul, so she knows all about hookah.
Yeah.
Right? And it can't be great for you, really.
Oh, for sure.
Smoke.
Not. Yeah.
But...
I mean, I started when I was like 13 to smoke hookah, and I am not proud of that. I think.
It was just there, though.
Yeah.
It was a different
Now there's
time.
COVID, so I'm a little worried. But anyway.
You also started smoking beer, drinking beer when you were 13 or 14,
true,
probably. Because in Istanbul, they don't ID you. They're just like, oh, business here. Yeah. Lovely. Have some beer.
Yeah, Prohibition really fucked us up in how we approach alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, 21.
Yeah,
like we treat it like a drug in this country. We don't treat it like we treat it like an illicit drug. We don't treat it like the social, communal, societal thing it should be, and it is in a lot of places.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that there can be all the careful measures about, if you're predisposed to alcoholism, you should be careful and all of that. But I feel like if the culture respected it more as something beautiful bond us together.
It's how you learn to drink, though. Like, Yanka, you probably learned having a little bit of wine at dinner or something with the family, right?
Like thought I was ready when I was 13 or 14.
Yeah, that's not as common in America. And if the kid is trying wine, it's a sneaky thing. They know that it's something they shouldn't do.
Take a sip from my glass,
And then when you get to the competitive teenage years where, like, at least with young males, you're trying to outcompete each other in everything you're doing because the hormones just kick that drive off, is drinking is one of them. And where do young American males learn to drink? Where do we learn to drink? Garages? Woods, house parties when the parents aren't home. Like, the worst environments for this. Like, whereas in Europe and other places, you can go into the pub at 16, 17, 18 and have a beer. And if you start acting like the idiot you are at that age, the community will police you. The 40-year-old sitting at the bar
or like you will face the consequences. You'll have to carry yourself to home, like when you're 15. Like if you're wasted, done. Don't do that again.
Well, not even that. I'm just saying, like the adult at the bar who's had five beers, and isn't wasted, and you've had two, and you're bumping into him. He's gonna make you look like a fool. Like, ideally not beat you up, but he's going to embarrass you in front of your peers and teach you, like, oh, I should get better at this. Like, and that's just not how it is in America. We learn to drink
secretly,
in backyards and secretively. And then we go off to college where it's a full-on competition. And by the time you're in your mid-20s, you either have an alcohol problem or you don't.
We go off to college where the game is, hey, here's a pyramid scheme where you go into high levels of debt. You don't really learn much and you become an alcoholic. Like, have fun.
Yeah, and I mean, those things can still happen, but there's a better way for the society.
I think so.
21 is such an old age, that's for sure. Like, if you really waited until 21
It is an interesting choice. I haven't thought deeply about it, but I feel like I don't understand why it's 21.
The chances that you're going to abuse it because it's such an old age to finally, like, do something legally.
The first times I went into a bar at, like, 21, sure, and was able to sit down and have a beer, like... I didn't know how to act in a bar. I mean, I was fine probably, but like you don't know. You just go in thinking like I'm hot shit. Like I've done this. I've drank 20 beers with my buddies in an alley.
yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but you were falling down and like a mess, and you weren't nearly as interesting as you thought you are. Now you're surrounded by strangers who all are going to pick up on that, who aren't drinking the same rate as you.
Yeah.
And that's why 21-year-olds are the worst fucking customers.
Right.
Like I used to hate bartending, and people would come in. And honestly, the guy whose 21st birthday it was, they were usually okay. It was their friends who were like 21 and a half who thought they were the big shot, the veteran with experience, who were throwing up in the bathroom.
Yeah, let me show you how to have 7 milkshake IPAs at 8%.
Yeah, and it's like, dude, it's like you've been here twice before. Like, don't act like your friend, like, oh, yeah, I know. They all know me here. Like, I got this.
It's like, nope. Actually, that gets into my... I have a few bonus questions to finish us off here, but the first one was, since you've worked as a bartender in breweries, like what have you noticed What have you learned about human beings from being behind the bar?
I've gotten really good at pretending to be interested.
I love the censor.
Like I've gotten really good at people, like even uncomfortable people. If you can get them talking about themselves, or if you can find out what they're interested in and get them going, they assume you're interested in it, or that you have something in common. And like that was an easy skill. I also have learned to not argue with people. Like I've gotten very good at not arguing, because when someone's been drinking, like it's best to just take their beer away.
Right, right,
Like,
right.
No, you don't want to have a conversation. Listen, you need to hand me that beer. I think you've had too much. Like you're just inviting an escalation. I got very good at de-escalating.
Right.
And
yeah.
even people regulars who, like were normal people that I would hang out with and have a beer, and they didn't overdo it, or even if they did, they handled themselves fine. But every now and then they just had a bad night, or they had a bad day, and then they have more than they should have, and now it's an issue. And you got to figure out how to get them home, or they're just being aggressive with you. And then they don't come by for a few weeks, and then they come back, and things are normal again. Like I just learned that, like people are, I don't know, there's more of a formula to people than I used to think. I used to think it was more random, but like
they find their routines.
Yeah. Also, I don't believe in doing last call anymore. If I owned a bar, I would get rid of last call. It's dumb because either you do last call, 30, 15 minutes before you close, right?
Yeah.
30 minutes usually. If somebody doesn't realize you're closing in a half hour and you tell them and they decide to get another beer, yeah, they probably don't need that beer.
Yeah.
And if they did want another beer and they were like, they're just hanging out and they're sipping them, like you don't want to give them a beer and then you're closing now and they have half a beer left. Because now that's
you see them grab their keys out of their pocket and you're like, wait a second. Why did you just chug another beer before you drive?
Yeah. If you've been here drinking all night, I don't need to shove another beer down your throat.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the hardest jobs of being a bartender, right? Is to find that line between
anybody, especially with beer, with craft beer, anyone can do that. Yeah. It's pulling a tap. It's just learning when to turn the glass. Yeah. Like anyone can pour the beer. It's being able to talk to people and being able to handle problems.
Yeah.
Like,
what's the worst problem you had to deal with?
I mean, I've had people threaten to hit me and threaten to fight me, threaten to come back with their friends and beat me up, stuff like that.
Yeah. Luckily, they were too drunk to accomplish that, probably, if they were doing that, right?
Yeah, this guy was falling asleep at his seat. I'm pretty sure he was on pills or heroin or something. And the bartender I was working with, she was young and not as experienced. And like he came up and ordered one beer and he was fine. And he sat down and like halfway through that beer, whatever he took started to kick in. And you could see it. And I told her, I was like, yeah, we got to cut him off. Like, don't give him another beer.
Yeah.
And she said, okay. And then he came back up like this, more than he should have been, wobbly from one beer. And she gave him another fucking beer.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, what are you doing? She's like, well, he only had one and I'm not going to give him a third one. And I was like, I said, don't give him another one.
Yeah.
She's like, yeah. And I was like, she feared that confrontation more than the repercussions of what's going to happen.
Right, right.
Of giving him the beer.
She'd rather that guy fall into the toilet than tell him, no, you can't get it.
Crack his head open and now it's a mess. Or he throws an empty glass at a customer. So I went and took his beer away and he started yelling at me. And I was like, here. And so I used to do this too. I just give them their money back.
Yeah.
I go, here's your money. You got a free beer out of us, but you got to go.
Yeah.
And yeah, he kept threatening me.
Yeah.
And then
we were actually at the brewery.
I always try to de-escalate, but as soon as I was like, yeah, sorry, you got to go, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, full of shit, man. You suck. I was like, okay, that's fine.
Totally, yeah.
And he goes, I should fucking hit you. As soon as he said that, I came back at him and I went, all right, get the fuck out now.
Yeah.
Puffed up and I got in his face. I was like, you can't talk to me like that in my fucking bar. Get out and don't ever come back.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, I'm going. I'm like, yeah, you better fucking go. And I said, and he came back like a week later and apologized to the manager.
He was just in a bad place. Yeah.
He was in a bad place. I mean, we found out later he was a heroin addict. I think his wife had died like the year before or something. And so like the guy was in a tough place, but it doesn't matter. Like I'm not going to.
I mean, you have to have a line as a bartender.
Right.
Yeah. We were sitting at the brewery 2 nights ago in our town and some guy, instead of coming in through the proper channel they made where they figure out where can you sit that's socially distanced and you have to have a mask on and all of that. They just came under the makeshift fence that they made, and they didn't have a mask, and they went in and bought a beer, and they came out, and she was like, wait, where did you come from? Like, you didn't come, like, blah, blah, blah. And he just said, like, fuck off, bitch. And she was like, that's it. You're done.
You gotta go.
You're out. And
You're
he's
done.
like, are you kidding me? I just bought this beer and
Don't care.
don't care. And then at the end, he's like, well, if you're not going to give me my money back, I'm taking my beer. She's like, yeah, go ahead and walk right onto Main Street with your beer. See what happens. Have fun. You know, like.
Well, I've had to do that where I actually, that's the craziest story. I'll tell it quickly. But like, I've had to tell people, if you get in that car right now, I'm calling the cops, and I'll take my phone out and be like, I'm going to watch your license plate as you drive away, and good luck getting home before they find you. Like,
right. Yeah. Because otherwise,
you know?
if they crash, isn't it like legal? Isn't there some legal connection?
It depends
to you?
on the state. Yeah. But in most states, it's on the server who physically gave them the alcohol, not the business, which is fucked up because a lot of businesses will push to overserve and put the liability on a minimum wage employee.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that's screwed up.
Yeah.
But so I had a guy show up, and he's an older guy. He had an Escalade, a big white Escalade. So I was like, okay, the guy's got some money or whatever. He came in, he's fine. He had one beer. You know, he was fine. He was laughing, meeting the regulars. I poured him a second beer. Halfway through the second beer, he started doing the teeter, you know, the weeble wobble. And I was like, what's going on? And then he leaned back and almost fell backwards and grabbed the bar. And he tried to order another beer, and I gave him a water instead. I was like, you need to have a water. That's the other thing. People that adamant that they needed another beer, you slow them down first because you're like, I don't want to kick you out and have you drive away, but I'm not giving you another beer. So I would say, have a water first, and then then we'll give you a beer out. Because sometimes they're being drunks and they just want to get drunk, and sometimes you're just in the moment. You are
genuine
getting drunk
miscalculation.
But sometimes you're just thirsty. Like, I need something to drink. Give me a beer. And it's like, have a bottle of water. And then they chug the water. Like, okay, I actually feel a little nauseous and I'm not thirsty. So maybe I shouldn't have. Like, sometimes it worked.
Yeah.
And people will be like, thanks for the water. I'm going to hang out. Can I have another one?
Yeah.
And then I'll go. And it's like, all right, yeah. It's been an hour. You're probably okay now.
Signal has been received.
Yeah. And some of the regulars, when you say, I think you should have a water, they'd be like, oh, I don't want to overstep here. This is my favorite bar. This is my neighborhood bar. I'm like, okay, don't want to piss off the bartender. Like, I'll have my water. I'll be all right.
Yeah.
You know, they just know. They're like, I want to keep drinking here, so I'll keep it together. Oh, I did have 3 beers in an hour. Yeah. 3 IPAs in an hour. Maybe I will have a water. Or they'd be like, I'm going to get something to eat from the food truck. And then a couple hours would go by and they're like, can I get one more? And they go, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
There's a weird soft strength that you have to have as a bartender, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this guy, and he starts calling me by the wrong name. I introduced myself, and he started calling me Steve, and I was like, that's not my name. And like, he's just like, his eyes aren't focusing or whatever. And I'm like, you got to have some water. And he's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And I took his beer away. And then the other bartender, he tried to order a beer from. And we both agreed, we're like, he was getting worse like by the minute. We're like, he can't leave.
Yeah.
Because he wants to leave because we wouldn't give him beer. And so she told him, she's like, you have to stay. We can't let you drive off right now. You need to finish your water, and then we'll talk about getting your ride home. And every time she turned to talk to someone, he'd try to sneak towards the door. And she'd be like, hey, sit back down, like a child. The guy was in his 60s, at least. And so like the bar got busy, and he just bolted and ran out the front door. And so I went to him, and I got him back into the bar to come inside. I was like, no, we're going to buy you a sandwich from the truck. And the food trucks would just give us food for drunk customers.
Yeah.
Like, we needed something for this guy. They would just give it to us. And while I was wrangling him, she looked in his car and saw he had a 5th of Crown Royal empty in the cup holder. So he chugged it right before walking in, because he was fine when he walked in. And then that first beer on top of that just pushed everything along, and the Crown Royal kicked in.
Oh, gosh, man.
So he was wasted. We realized he was wasted if he drank that whole bottle. And so he tried to sneak out to his car again. And I told him that speech. I was like, if you get in your car, I'm calling the police right now.
Yeah.
Like, he was standing next to his car again, trying to fumble with his keys. I was like, you can't drive. I will call the cops and you will go to jail.
And it's like, it sounds like, oh, you're being a dick to me. It's like, no, I'm trying to save you from your inevitable failure 10 minutes from now.
So we said, we're calling you an Uber. He goes, oh, I live like 30 minutes away. Like, I'm not paying that. I'm like, we'll pay for it, okay? Like, the company set that up. We had an Uber account. And I was like, we'll pay you for it. Don't worry. You can come back and get your car tomorrow. And he's like, fine. So we get the Uber. We put him in it. He leaves, and like I just didn't trust the guy. So we're looking at it on the app because it is like a 30-minute drive. Like it was way too far for him to drunk drive. You should never drunk drive, but like a 30-40-minute drive on the highway when he was blasted like that, it's not happening at night.
Yeah.
So we look, he gets to the highway like 5 minutes from the brewery, and I watch the car turn around and start coming back. And I go, this motherfucker, he's telling the Uber driver to take him back. And so he comes back. And I'm waiting at his car, and I go, you got to go. Goes, oh, sorry, no, I just forgot something. And he does it, and he tries it again, and he comes back even faster. And so I'm standing there, and I'm calling 911 now. Like, I'm calling them because blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, blah, blah. And I turn to the Uber driver, and I say, if you keep bringing him back here, I have to call 911. So you should just take him home, or you're going to have to wait for the police so you can fill out. You're going to be on the police report.
You're going to be part of this whole ordeal.
And you can see the Uber driver's like, fuck. So... like I follow the dot. I have to watch it while bartending, and we were busy. I had to keep looking at the iPad to make sure it was staying on the highway, and it got home. And then as soon as it gets dropped off, like within a few minutes, he starts calling the bar every minute. And we go, please hold, because we have lines of customers. He'd hang up and call back. So the phone's just constantly ringing. And he's like, oh, that the guy, I left my stuff in his car. You got to tell him to come back and get me and take me back to the blah, blah, blah.
Jesus.
Like he's still trying to come back and get his car. And he's like, oh, I left my phone. I'm calling from my house phone. You got to get a hold of the guy. Like, I don't know who he is, blah, blah, blah. And you can't call the Uber driver. You can only message them and ask them to call you.
Yeah.
So we kept doing
the number
that.
is hidden. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we kept doing that and be like, we think this guy, blah, blah, blah. Like, we're worried he was going to get another Uber and pick his car up that night. Like, after we left. Or, like, I can't be in the parking lot watching his car all night.
Yeah.
So... eventually, the Uber driver calls and he goes, oh, he thinks he left it in your car. But I goes, no, that guy's fucking crazy. He kept trying to throw his shit in the car and said, wait here, I'm going to run inside, and then I need you to take me back. And the Uber driver's trying to, that's not how this works. Like, the ride's done. Like, you didn't pay for this ride. Like, you can't add another ride to not your account. Like, so he said he would be like, oh, no, here, and like threw his shit through the window of the car. And then ran into the house. And he said, he's like, I'm not dealing with that guy. I took his stuff and put it on his mailbox and left and got the fuck out of there. And trying to explain to the guy on the phone, your shit's in your mailbox because the Uber driver he didn't get that.
Yeah.
And he kept calling and calling, and we ended up just blocking his number and then never saw him again.
Oh gosh.
Wow.
But that was like a Wednesday night. That was one of the craziest times I had to deal with.
That's the best part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's end on a more positive note than the darkness of
Over drinking.
of wasted Wednesday night
Incapable
humans.
people.
What's the best beer you've ever had?
The best beer I've ever had. That's tough. I can't go by taste.
If you can't like have one best, just say whatever popped into your head.
The
as I
best
asked it.
beer experience I ever had was probably the first time I made a good homebrew, because it took like 5 to 10 batches for it to not good, but to come out how I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Sure. Yeah.
like you might try to cook a dish and you're like, well, this isn't what I meant to make, but it's good.
Yeah.
And in beer, like I was saying, so much of it's about control that when you try to make a beer taste a certain way and it comes out different, it's disappointing. You know,
Right.
So it was probably the first time I got my amber ale right, my Sparge's Delight, which I still have brewed more than any other recipe I've made.
So you
It's the
saved that
first recipe I wrote.
You saved that recipe and recreated it like a bunch of times?
Yeah, I have it all written down. I think I've done it like 8 or 9 times now. And I tweaked it a little bit each time, but there's a couple of major changes I did early on between batches, and it came out exactly what I wanted. It was good. It was delicious. And it was the first beer I made I was comfortable sharing with people.
Yeah.
You know, that was probably my best.
Yeah, but you get the satisfaction.
Jeez, I sound like an ass.
Of
It's
knowing
the beer
that
I made.
You
What an
had
asshole
a
thing
say
to
in
say.
how it comes out. You know, that's a really powerful thing to know that,
Right.
oh, I chose to do this variable this way, and it came out exactly what I was aiming at.
Yeah, so that was probably...
So let me just clarify, the best beer you've ever had is your own beer.
I know, what an ass. It's not. I'm not saying I'm an amazing home brewer.
No,
either.
I
Like,
totally get what you mean. I'm just
No.
playing.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's obviously meaning behind it. So.
Like, for example, if I got into roasting coffee, I could imagine a coffee brewed from coffee I roasted would be more meaningful than buying from
Even if it's not the best you've ever had, it might be your most exciting experience.
most meaningful. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
So I'm gonna I'm wording your question to make it easier to answer for me, and more self-promoting by saying it's the beer, the most rewarding thing.
And you could also say, I've just had too much beers to even ascertain answering that question on the fly.
I forget what I was talking about. I'm going to end it with a fucked up joke here. How family friendly is this podcast?
We could always put the explicit label on it.
Okay. He was asking me about, because I have a friend who I've recently gotten really into home brewing. His fiance hates me. He's spending way too much money on the hobby, but he's gotten really into it lately, and he's getting really good at it. And we start talking about sours and wild ales, and he's like, I just can't really get into that. He's like, how do you he's like, and I was describing this one really funky farmhouse ale, and he's like, how do you like that? And I was like, well, it's like, they say, like porn stars, like you need to punch them in the face for them to get aroused now because they've just done it all, right? And it's like, I've drank so much beer, like you got to pump the gas. The vanilla type, like a professional porn star who's done 10,000 videos, like, I don't know, maybe, but probably not holding hands and like kissing a little bit.
Some sexy lingerie picture is not enough.
Yeah. Ooh, there's some ankle showing in this one. Like, no, you need to pump the gas a little for them. And it's like, I've had so much beer. It's like, yeah, I love the weirder stuff now.
You want to take more risks. Yeah.
Yes. The weirder, funkier beers are what I'm into. So,
all right. Well, you don't have to hang up, but I'm going to hit stop on the recording. So I'll say thanks for coming on, and I'll see you in 1 second when I hit stop.
Okay. Thanks for having me, guys.
Peace.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Exploring Kodawari. If you enjoyed it, we hope you'll consider sharing it on social media and with friends. You can also help us out by leaving a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Those help us more than you would think. And if you'd like to help us out in a more substantial way, consider going over to our website to make a donation through PayPal. Links are in the episode notes for this. You can do this as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly donation. All of that support will help us to set aside time in order to create content for the podcast and the blog. And finally, please get in touch with us and say hi, either on social media or privately through email. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.